Britain is often introduced through ink, through crowns sketched in margins, through dates pressed into parchment, through kings whose names survived because someone wrote them down. Castles rise first in the imagination, followed by banners, battles, and the careful handwriting of monks. This is where history usually begins. But this beginning is not the beginning at all. Long before the first chronicle, Britain was already old. Hills had watched generations pass without ever being named. Rivers followed their courses without carrying titles, borders, or recorded meaning. Communities lived, worked, and died in places that would later be called ancient, even though to them, those places were simply home. Nothing about their lives felt unfinished. Nothing felt temporary. They did not know they were before anything. Writing has a strange power. It convinces us that what appears on the page is where reality starts. Everything earlier becomes shadowy, uncertain, almost unreal. Without words to anchor it, the deep past feels empty, as if no one was truly there. Yet Britain before writing was not silent. It was full of sound, movement, and memory. It was remembered differently. In a world without pages, memory did not belong to books. It belonged to land. Paths remembered footsteps. Fields remembered seasons. Fires remembered hands that returned to them night after night. Stories were not fixed, they were renewed. Each retelling adjusted gently, like a river changing its course without forgetting its direction. Meaning survived not because it was preserved, but because it was repeated. This is the part of Britain that rarely appears in history books. Not because it lacked complexity, but because it did not fit easily into lines of text. These societies did not measure themselves by beginnings and endings. They moved in cycles. What mattered was not when something started, but whether it continued. Survival itself was the record. Later, when writing finally arrived, it brought structure, it brought order, but it also brought selection. Some lives were written down, others were quietly left behind. The moment ink touched parchment, history narrowed. It chose voices that sounded familiar to those holding the pen. Everything else faded into background noise, even if it had once shaped the world. This is why Britain's written history feels so confident and yet so thin. It speaks clearly about a small slice of time and grows quiet the further back it looks. The silence is often mistaken for absence. But absence is not emptiness. It is simply another kind of archive. Before castles and kings, Britain was already layered with meaning. Rituals marked time where calendars did not exist. Knowledge moved through observation, imitation, and shared experience. Children learned the land not from maps, but from walking it. Elders taught memory not through dates, but through practice. The land itself carried instruction. What we call prehistory was never a blank space. It was a different way of remembering, a way that did not rely on permanence, but on continuity. Nothing was frozen. Everything was alive. And when later ages looked back, they mistook this living memory for loss. As the familiar images of medieval Britain dissolve, something older comes into view. Not a primitive world, but a complete one. A Britain that did not need to announce itself to exist. To understand what was truly here, the illusion of a clear historical beginning must first fall away. Only then can we begin to see who decided what was worth remembering and what was allowed to disappear. In that deeper view, time stretches outward instead of forward. The past is not behind, but beneath, layered patiently under every later story. Britain did not emerge suddenly when someone wrote its name. It accumulated quietly, life upon life, memory upon memory, waiting not to be discovered, but to be noticed. This quiet beginning asks us to listen differently, before written voices take over the telling entirely of the past. History did not arrive in Britain by accident. It arrived when certain voices gained the tools to preserve themselves. In quiet rooms of stone, far from fields and rivers, monks bent over desks and decided where the story would start. Their work feels neutral to us now, careful and patient, but it carried an unspoken power. To write history is not only to remember, it is to choose. The world these chroniclers inherited was already old. It was filled with stories that moved by mouth and gesture, through ritual, habit, and place. But these forms of memory did not translate easily onto the page. They had no fixed dates, no single authors, no clear beginnings. Faced with this, the scribes did something subtle. They simplified. They drew lines where none had existed before. They turned a living landscape of memory into a sequence. Monasteries became more than religious centers. They became gateways to permanence. What passed through them could endure. What did not remained fragile, spoken once and then lost to time. This was not cruelty, it was limitation. Writing demands shape, and shape demands exclusion. A life without a king, a law without parchment, a belief without scripture. These were difficult to recognize as history at all. So early, Britain was reframed. What could not be fitted into Christian purpose or Roman order was set aside. The distant past was described as confusion, darkness, or myth, not because it lacked meaning, but because it operated by rules the writers did not share. Linear time replaced cycles. Named rulers replaced shared authority. Events replaced processes. The past became narrower but clearer. This is where the illusion of a clean beginning was born. History appeared to start when names appeared. Everything before felt like a prologue that could be skipped. The effect was powerful. Once written, this version of the past felt solid, unquestionable. It carried the confidence of ink, and confidence persuades. Yet nothing had truly begun at that moment. Life did not change simply because it was described differently. Fields were still worked, seasons still returned, old paths were still walked. But now a new frame sat over the land, defining what mattered and what did not. Memory became selective, not only in what it preserved, but in how it understood what was preserved. The chroniclers did not see themselves as erasing anything. They believed they were rescuing the past from silence. But silence was not the same as absence. It was simply a language they did not speak. Oral worlds do not announce themselves in dates or documents. They endure through repetition, not preservation. When writing encountered them, it mistook flexibility for disorder. This is why early Britain often appears unfinished in written history, as if waiting for Rome or Christianity to give it structure. In reality, structure already existed. It was just invisible to those trained to look for authority in text. What could not be governed by ink was treated as prelude. Once history chose its beginning, everything else was pushed behind it. Not destroyed, but blurred. The past became quieter, less certain, easier to dismiss. Over time, this quiet was mistaken for emptiness. The choice hardened into tradition, and tradition rarely questions its own starting point. Understanding this does not require blame. It requires perspective. The scribes wrote what they could see. They recognized order where it resembled their own. They filtered the past through the lenses available to them. What passed through became history. What did not remained life, lived fully, then left unwritten. As this written framework settled over Britain, it reshaped memory itself. What people believed about their own past slowly aligned with what survived on the page. And yet, beneath that surface, older ways of living continued, untouched by parchment. To see them, we must step away from written beginnings and look again at how people lived before writing decided what history was allowed to be. Britain once lived without pages. Days did not begin with dates, but with light. Morning was recognized by mist lifting from fields, by fires cooled to embers, by animals stirring before people did. Time moved through seasons, not numbers. Life followed cycles that returned reliably, even when individual lives ended. Nothing needed to be written to be known. Memory was woven into routine, gesture, and shared attention to the world around them. It was a Britain that measured itself by continuity, not records, and by belonging, not definition. Identity did not arrive through names fixed to paper. It formed through kinship, proximity, and repetition. A person was known by who they stood beside, who they shared work with, who remembered them when they were absent. Children learned who they were by watching where they were placed, what tasks were trusted to them, and which stories were told in their presence. Meaning did not come from explanation, it came from participation. To belong was to be involved, not documented. Work carried memory forward. Hands shaped tools in ways learned from other hands, copying movements refined across generations. Nothing was invented in isolation. Knowledge moved through imitation, corrected gently over time. Mistakes were remembered without being recorded. Success endured because it worked, not because it was preserved. A method that failed quietly disappeared. A method that sustained life remained. In this way, practice became proof. Evenings gathered people together without instruction. Fires drew stories out naturally, not as performances, but as reminders. Stories did not belong to individuals. They belonged to places, to paths walked often enough to demand explanation, to stones whose presence invited meaning. Each retelling shifted slightly, not to distort truth, but to keep it alive. What mattered was not precision, but relevance. Stories survived because they continued to speak. This way of remembering confuses modern eyes. Without writing, we assume fragility. We imagine loss where there was movement. Yet oral memory was not brittle. It adapted. When landscapes changed, stories adjusted. When needs shifted, practices followed. Nothing was locked in place. Flexibility was not weakness, it was endurance. What could bend lasted longer than what could not. Ritual played a quiet role in this continuity. Repeated actions marked transitions that writing later tried to fix with dates. Birth, death, planting, harvest, and change were acknowledged through shared behavior rather than recorded milestones. These moments did not need explanation. They needed recognition. By acting together, people remembered together. Memory lived in the body as much as in the mind. What writing later called prehistory was never an empty stretch of time. It was full of attention, awareness, and inherited understanding. These societies did not wait to be recorded to exist. They were complete within their own systems. Their knowledge did not vanish simply because it was not written. It lingered in habits that survived long after words arrived to rename them. When writing finally entered Britain, it did not replace this older memory all at once. For a long time, both existed together. Pages recorded what they could see. Lives continued as they always had. The written world felt permanent, but the practiced world endured. Ink could fade. Practice returned every season. This matters because it changes what survival means. What lasts longest is not always what is preserved. It is what is repeated without needing to be explained. Britain without pages was not waiting for history to begin. It was already remembering itself carefully through living. To understand these people fully, the story must now move further back, beyond labels and later names, into a time before tribes were defined at all, when belonging came before identity, and memory walked the land without ever needing to be written. Britain was not always surrounded by water. This fact alone quietly rearranges everything that comes after it. Long before boats mattered, before coasts defined edges, The land we now call Britain was simply part of a much larger world. There was no moment of arrival, no crossing. People did not come to Britain. They moved within it, walking across ground that felt continuous, familiar, and shared. Where the North Sea now stretches wide and cold, there was once land. Forests grew there. Rivers braided through plains. Animals followed seasonal paths worn smooth by generations of movement. Humans followed those same paths, not as pioneers, but as participants in a landscape that offered no sign it would one day disappear. This place is often called Doggerland, but that name is modern. To those who lived there, it was not a region, it was home. In this older world, Europe had no sharp edges. Movement flowed naturally across open ground. Families shifted with herds. Groups separated and rejoined without ceremony. Identity was shaped by travel and familiarity rather than borders. The idea of an island did not exist because there was no need for it. Water marked rivers, not limits. As the climate slowly warmed, change arrived without drama. Ice retreated. Seas rose gradually, almost politely. At first, the shifts were subtle. Marshland crept inward. Forests thinned. Paths grew damp, then unreliable. What had once been safe ground demanded adjustment. People adapted, as they always had. They moved camps. They altered routes. They remembered where the land still held firm. There was no single moment of loss. Doggerland did not vanish in a day. It withdrew over generations. Grandparents remembered open ground where grandchildren found water. Stories carried these changes forward, not as tragedy, but as guidance. Certain places became dangerous. Certain paths were no longer used. Memory adjusted to the land's slow transformation. Eventually, water claimed what remained. What had once connected became barrier. Britain emerged not through separation, but through submergence. The island was not formed by departure, but by drowning, and even then, people did not disappear. They simply lived on higher ground. The land they lost remained present in memory long after it vanished beneath the sea. This is why Britain's earliest history does not feel like migration. It feels like continuation. People did not arrive as strangers. They remained as residents. Their knowledge of animals, weather, and terrain did not reset when coastlines formed. It narrowed, concentrating experience into new spaces. The island inherited memory that was older than its shape. Modern maps make this difficult to feel. They present Britain as isolated, distinct, defined by water. But for most of human presence here, that isolation did not exist. Connection came first, separation came later. And when it did, it was experienced quietly, absorbed into daily life rather than marked by ceremony or record. The loss of Doggerland is often discussed in terms of geology, but for those who lived through it, it was personal. Hunting grounds disappeared. Familiar landmarks failed to return. Certain stories could no longer be visited, yet nothing suggests panic or collapse. The change was slow enough to be carried forward, step by step, generation by generation. This reframing matters because it dissolves the idea of Britain as a destination. It was never a place people sought out. It was simply where the land allowed life to continue. The earliest Britons were not islanders by choice. They became islanders by circumstance, shaped by water rising patiently around them. Once people remained on this higher ground, survival began to shape culture more tightly. The landscape narrowed. Resources became more defined. Attention turned inward. To understand what followed, the story must now shift from movement to adaptation, from open plains to lived terrain, where survival began with learning the land itself. Britain, after the ice, was not empty, and it was not helpless. The cold had retreated slowly, leaving behind a land reshaped by pressure and release. Valleys opened, forests returned, Rivers ran new courses. Into this changing world lived people who did not wait for stability. They learned as the land changed, reading its signals with careful attention, responding not with force, but with understanding. These early Britons did not wander blindly. Their movements followed patterns refined through experience. They knew when animals would return, where shelter could be trusted, which ground drained quickly after rain. Knowledge was not abstract. It was practical, immediate, and shared. A hillside was not scenery. It was information. A river bend was not a view. It was a decision point. Tools reflected this awareness. Stone blades were shaped to suit specific tasks, not as symbols, but as solutions. Wood was selected, cut, and bent with intention. Shelters were placed where wind softened and light arrived early. Nothing suggests improvisation. Everything suggests planning carried quietly forward, generation by generation. Seasonal movement was not chaos. It was structure without walls. People returned to the same places because those places worked. Camps reappeared where resources aligned, not because they were owned, but because they were reliable. This rhythm created familiarity without permanence. The land remained shared, but knowledge of it was precise. Survival in this world did not rely on constant struggle. It relied on restraint. Knowing when not to hunt mattered as much as knowing how. Knowing when to move prevented loss. This kind of intelligence leaves little trace. It does not announce itself in monuments or ruins. It survives in absence, in the lack of disaster. Modern imagination often underestimates this skill because it looks for signs of domination. But these people did not seek to overpower their surroundings. They aligned with them. Ice had taught patience. Wood taught flexibility. Together, these lessons shaped a culture grounded in awareness rather than control. Fire became more than warmth. It was a meeting point where planning happened quietly. Food was prepared with foresight, not urgency. Stories shared near flame were not distractions. They were memory systems, encoding routes, warnings, and lessons in forms that could travel without weight. Children learned early by watching, not instruction. Mistakes were corrected gently, not recorded. Competence emerged through repetition, not explanation. This created continuity stronger than any written rule. What worked stayed. What failed faded without drama. They left no cities because they did not need them. They left no walls because movement was safer than enclosure. Their mastery was invisible because it was balanced. When later ages looked back, they saw emptiness where there had been precision. As the land became familiar again after ice, something subtle began to change. Survival was no longer the only concern. Attention turned toward pattern, repetition, and shared meaning. The landscape was not just lived in, it was noticed. And from that noticing, something new began to form, quietly, without announcement. This shift did not arrive as belief or doctrine. It arrived as attention lingering longer than necessary. Certain places felt different, not because they were claimed, but because they were returned to. Tracks became familiar. Clearings gathered stories. Over time, usefulness gathered meaning. The land was no longer only read. It was felt. This feeling did not replace survival. It deepened it. People began to notice patterns beyond need, rhythms that suggested order beyond hunger or shelter. These early recognitions were quiet, fragile, and easily missed by later eyes. Yet they mattered. From them grew the first sense that life carried significance beyond endurance. This was not religion yet. It was awareness settling into habit, preparing the ground for symbols, ritual, and memory that would soon reach further than survival alone. Those foundations would quietly support everything that followed, even when later histories forgot where their earliest balance began in this northern land. Before stone stood upright, memory already marked the land. Meaning arrived quietly, without walls or weight. Certain places were returned to again and again, not because they offered shelter, but because they felt held. Clearings gathered attention. River bends invited pause. Paths became familiar not only through use, but through story. Long before monuments appeared, the land itself was already arranged by remembrance. Death did not end presence in this early Britain. It altered it. Bodies were placed with care, accompanied by objects that had meaning beyond function. Tools worn smooth by hands, pigments carried from afar, items broken deliberately before burial. These were not gestures of fear. They were acknowledgments that relationships did not stop when breath did. What mattered was not explanation, but repetition. The same paths were walked, the same clearings were used, the same sites received attention across generations. No one needed to be told why. The reason lived in return itself. Memory was reinforced by movement, by bodies occupying the same spaces again and again, until familiarity itself carried meaning. These early rituals left little behind that stone could capture. Wood decayed, fire vanished, words dissolved into air. What endured were patterns, a bend avoided, a grove respected, a stretch of ground left untouched. Such choices were not random. They were remembered agreements between people and place, renewed each time they were honored. In this way, Britain became sacred long before it became monumental. Belief did not descend from above. It emerged from attention sustained over time. The land taught what mattered by responding to care. Where life continued, meaning gathered. Where loss occurred, caution remained. Sacredness was not declared. It was learned. Later generations would struggle to recognize this kind of devotion. Without temples or idols, it appeared incomplete. Without walls, it seemed unprotected. But the absence of architecture did not mean the absence of order. It meant order lived elsewhere. It lived in memory, shared and carried, not stored. When stone finally entered this world, it did not invent belief. It responded to it. Memory had reached a point where it asked for permanence. Certain places had grown heavy with return. Attention had accumulated long enough to demand form. Stone answered not as innovation, but as continuation. The first sacred sites were not statements, they were anchors. They fixed memory in place, allowing it to survive change without losing meaning. What followed would shape Britain visibly, but its roots lay in something quieter. Long before stone circles rose against the sky, the land was already speaking. This early sacred landscape did not need to explain itself. It was understood through presence rather than instruction. To stand in the same place as those before you was to inherit their attention. To repeat their actions was to keep memory alive. Nothing required definition to be felt. Archaeology would later uncover fragments of this world, but fragments are all it can find. Meaning did not sit in objects alone. It lived in relationships between places, actions, and time. Remove one element, and the rest fall silent. This is why so much remains elusive. The sacred Britain of this era cannot be mapped cleanly. It resists tidy explanation. That resistance is not a flaw. It is evidence of a worldview that valued continuity over clarity. Meaning was not captured. It was carried, step by step, across generations who trusted memory more than markers. As survival stabilized and attention deepened, these remembered places quietly prepared the ground for something new. Memory alone could guide only so far. Eventually, it sought shape. Eventually, it asked to stand. In time, stone would rise where memory had already settled. What followed would appear sudden in the record, but it was anything but. Stone did not interrupt memory. It preserved it in another language. The next chapter begins where remembrance reaches outward, transforming lived experience into forms meant to endure. To understand why this change mattered, we must stay with the past a moment longer, listening as memory gathers weight, just before it learns how to hold itself in stone. That quiet tension shapes everything that comes next, and lingers beneath the monuments yet to rise across this ancient landscape of Britain. The change did not announce itself. Britain did not wake one morning transformed. The shift arrived slowly, almost invisibly, carried in small decisions repeated often enough to reshape a world. Seeds were placed into soil and left behind. Trees were cut not for fire, but to open space. People stayed where they once moved on. The land began to answer human intention, and in that exchange something new emerged. This was the Neolithic, though no one living through it would have known the name. What they felt instead was patience stretching forward. Farming required belief in a future that could not be seen. A planted field offered no immediate reward. It demanded trust that seasons would return as expected, that weather would cooperate just enough, that others would remain nearby to protect and tend what had been started. This was not a technological leap. It was a psychological one. To clear land was to commit to it. To build structures meant planning for years rather than days. Stone tools changed shape, not because people suddenly became inventive, but because their needs became longer. A polished axe was not just sharper. It represented time invested in permanence. The land was no longer only followed. It was shaped, carefully and deliberately. Settlements did not replace movement entirely. People still traveled, still adapted, still read the land closely. But certain places gained weight. They became reliable enough to return to, important enough to protect. Homes were repaired rather than abandoned. Storage appeared not as excess, but as insurance against uncertainty. The future was no longer something approached step by step. It was something prepared for. This altered how people thought about time. Cycles still mattered, but now they were guided. Fields remembered labor. Boundaries mattered because effort had been placed within them. The land began to reflect human intention, and that reflection changed how people saw themselves. They were no longer only responding, they were anticipating. Nothing about this transition suggests sudden control or domination. It was cautious, tested, reversible at first. Crops failed. Experiments were abandoned. Knowledge spread unevenly, but gradually success reinforced belief. The land began to speak back in yields, in predictability, in patterns that rewarded care. Attention deepened. Observation became more precise. This new relationship carried responsibility. To plant was to risk loss. To stay was to face consequences rather than avoid them. Communities became more interdependent. Planning mattered because mistakes affected more than one season. Memory extended forward instead of backward. Decisions were made with people not yet born in mind. Stone entered daily life differently now. It was not only shaped for use, but for endurance. Tools were repaired rather than discarded. Structures were aligned deliberately. Clearing land left marks that lasted longer than footsteps. Britain's landscape began to change in ways that would be visible long after the people themselves were gone. This was not the end of older ways. Hunting, gathering, and movement continued alongside farming. The past did not vanish. It layered. But something essential had shifted. The land was no longer only a guide. It became a partner in long-term thinking. Meaning followed this change naturally. When effort stretches across years, attention follows. Certain places gathered significance because so much labor had been invested there. Fields held memory. Structures anchored presence. The idea of return expanded beyond seasons into generations. What mattered most was not productivity, but continuity. These early farmers were not chasing abundance. They were securing stability. Their choices reshaped Britain slowly, without spectacle, but with lasting effect. The future entered quietly, seed by seed, altering how people understood time, responsibility, and place. As permanence took hold, a new desire began to form. If land could be shaped, perhaps time could be marked. If effort could endure, perhaps memory could be fixed more clearly. From this patient transformation grew the impulse to measure cycles more precisely, to align action with sky and season. With permanence came the need to mark it. The next step would not be louder, but more deliberate, as people began to look upward, seeking patterns beyond the soil itself. Stone did not rise suddenly as spectacle. It emerged slowly, placed with care, responding to needs that had already formed. Across Britain, stones were lifted and arranged not to dominate the land, but to converse with it. These were not monuments meant to be admired from a distance. They were instruments meant to be used, felt, and returned to. What mattered was not size, but position. Stones stood where light touched them in particular ways, where shadows shortened or stretched at meaningful moments. People watched the sky without naming it, tracking patterns through repetition rather than calculation. Seasons were not measured by numbers, but by alignment. When sun and stone met as expected, time confirmed itself. These places did not belong to one group alone. Similar forms appeared across wide distances, suggesting shared understanding rather than imitation. Knowledge moved quietly, carried by travelers, gatherings, and memory. No single site held authority. Together, they formed a network of attention spread across the land. To stand within a circle was not to witness mystery, but to participate in order. The stones did not explain anything. They allowed experience to repeat reliably. The turning year could be felt rather than guessed. Planting, gathering, and rest aligned naturally with what the stones revealed. Modern eyes often search for drama here, expecting secret codes or lost science. But the precision of these places did not depend on complexity. It depended on patience. Generations watched, adjusted, and corrected placement until it worked. Once it did, it endured. Stones fixed memory in a way wood and story could not. They resisted decay. They held position. In doing so, they allowed memory to settle into place. People could return knowing the pattern would still be there. Time became visible. This visibility carried weight. Where stones stood, people gathered. Where people gathered, influence grew. Those who understood the alignments guided action, not through command, but through timing, knowing when mattered more than knowing why. The stones did not grant power by themselves. They concentrated it. Attention flowed toward those places and toward those who maintained them. Quiet authority emerged, rooted not in force, but in reliability. When to plant, when to wait, when to prepare. These sites were never isolated wonders. They were part of a shared language written in stone across Britain. Each circle echoed others. Each alignment reinforced understanding beyond any single valley or community. The land itself became a calendar. Over time, the presence of stone changed how memory was trusted. What had once lived only in practice now stood visibly against the sky. This did not replace older ways. It strengthened them. Memory gained form without losing flexibility. As stones continued to rise, their meaning deepened. They were no longer just tools for marking time. They became anchors for gathering, decision, and belief. Around them, roles sharpened. Knowledge gathered. Power, once diffuse, began to settle. What followed was not sudden rule, but gradual focus. As stone fixed memory in place, people began to notice who stood closest to it, who spoke with its authority, and who learned its patterns best. From quiet precision grew quiet influence, setting the stage for new forms of leadership, shaped by understanding rather than force. This influence did not announce itself with crowns or commands. It moved softly, carried by trust, earned through accuracy and care. People returned because the stones did not fail them. Seasons arrived as expected. Gatherings aligned. Over time, this reliability reshaped relationships. Authority became linked to insight rather than strength. Those who listened longest guided most quietly. In this way, stone did more than mark time. It reorganized society without force, preparing Britain for hierarchies that felt natural because they emerged from shared experience, not imposed rule. And this quiet shift would echo long after stone itself faded into legend. These arrangements quietly shaped belief, memory, and belonging. Setting foundations, later, histories would misinterpret entirely. Long before crowns appeared, influence already existed. It did not sit on thrones or pass through bloodlines. It moved quietly, carried by those who understood how the world repeated itself. In early Britain, power did not announce itself. It revealed itself through timing, memory, and trust. Certain individuals paid closer attention than others. They watched the sun's return, the lengthening of days, the subtle changes that signaled when to act and when to wait. They remembered patterns that stretched beyond a single lifetime. This knowledge was not owned, it was held, and those who held it shaped decisions simply by knowing when something should happen. Communities did not need commands, they needed guidance. When to plant, when to gather, when to pause. The people who could answer these questions gained influence without force. Their authority was relational, not imposed. It rested on reliability. When their understanding proved accurate, people returned. Trust accumulated slowly, reinforced each season. This form of leadership left little trace for later histories to recognize. There were no titles carved in stone, no records to preserve status. Power flowed through presence. Those closest to ritual sites, seasonal gatherings, and shared memory stood at the center not by decree, but by familiarity. They were recognized because they were depended upon. Ritual was not performance, it was coordination. Actions repeated together aligned the group with patterns larger than any individual. Those who guided these moments did so carefully, aware that misjudgment carried consequences. A mistimed ritual meant confusion. A failed alignment meant uncertainty. Precision mattered because lives depended on it. This is why influence gathered around understanding rather than strength. Physical dominance offered little advantage in a system built on cooperation and foresight. What mattered was remembering what others forgot, noticing what others missed. The sacred was not separate from daily life. It was embedded within it, guiding action invisibly. Over time, this concentration of knowledge created quiet hierarchy. Not rigid layers, but gradients of influence. Some people listened more than they spoke. Some spoke only when necessary. Their words carried weight because they were rare. Silence was part of authority. This structure was stable because it was flexible. If someone failed repeatedly, trust moved elsewhere. Knowledge could be challenged by experience. Nothing was fixed permanently. Authority survived only as long as it continued to serve the group. In this way, power remained accountable to results rather than symbols. Later ages would struggle to recognize this system. Without kings or laws, it would appear formless. Yet it governed behavior effectively. Decisions emerged through consensus, shaped by insight. The sacred was not controlled by command, but by shared recognition of who understood the world most clearly. This balance would not last unchanged. As new materials entered Britain, the nature of influence would shift. Knowledge tied to cycles and seasons would encounter knowledge tied to objects, trade, and accumulation. Memory-based authority would meet new forms of power that moved faster and traveled further. But in this early moment, Before metal reshaped relationships, control of the sacred remained subtle. It rested in listening, not claiming. Those who guided ritual did not separate themselves from others. They lived among them, bound by the same risks and rewards. Their influence depended on continued alignment with the land. This form of power left Britain deeply shaped even after it faded. It trained communities to trust understanding over force, timing over speed, memory over possession. When later hierarchies emerged, they did so on ground already prepared by centuries of quiet leadership. As bronze arrived, bringing objects that carried value beyond use, this balance began to change. Knowledge would still matter, but it would no longer stand alone. New forms of authority would rise alongside old ones, altering how power gathered and how it was recognized. The sacred would remain, but its guardianship would be tested, reshaped by materials that carried influence in ways memory alone never had. When metal entered Britain, it did not arrive as thunder. It came quietly, carried in small quantities, shaped with care, and valued long before it was common. Bronze did not simply make tools stronger. It changed how people understood distance, time, and connection. For the first time, everyday life depended on places far beyond the horizon. Bronze could not be made from what lay nearby. Tin and copper were scattered across distant landscapes, separated by rivers, mountains, and sea crossings. To hold a bronze blade was to hold the result of many hands, many journeys, and many agreements. Each object carried a history of movement. It had already traveled before it was ever used. This changed how value was understood. A stone tool belonged to the place it came from. A bronze object belonged to a network. Its worth was not only in its edge or weight, but in the trust that brought its materials together. Someone had promised something. Someone had delivered. Someone had waited. Time stretched outward, connecting strangers who would never meet. Britain, once shaped mostly by local rhythms, now became quietly linked to distant worlds. People mattered who lived far away. Decisions made elsewhere affected life here. This was not empire. It was relationship. Roots formed gradually, remembered not by maps, but by repetition. Paths over land, crossings over water. Exchanges that returned often enough to feel dependable. Metalworking itself required patience. Heating, shaping, cooling, and finishing demanded skill learned over years. Those who worked metal did not act alone. They relied on steady supply and shared knowledge. Cooperation became embedded in the object itself. Every bronze item was proof that people could coordinate across space and time. Weapons emerged, but conflict was not the defining story. Bronze tools improved farming, woodworking, and daily labor as much as defense. Their spread suggests collaboration more than conquest. A blade moved because someone chose to pass it on, not because it was taken. Exchange strengthened bonds as often as it tested them. As bronze circulated, it carried stories with it. Where it came from mattered. Who provided it mattered. Objects began to represent relationships. Gifting took on new weight. Obligation traveled alongside material. The past was no longer only remembered locally. It extended along routes of trade, carried by things that endured. This widened sense of time altered planning. Materials could be delayed. Routes could fail. Trust had to be maintained. People learned to think beyond immediate seasons, considering years and distant partners. The future expanded outward, shaped by expectation rather than certainty. Britain did not become crowded with strangers, but it became aware of them. The world grew larger without becoming louder. There were no announcements, no records, no proclamations. Connections settled into daily life quietly, almost unnoticed, until it became normal. This shift did not erase older ways. Memory-based authority still mattered. Ritual still guided action. But now, another layer existed. Value could be stored, moved, and displayed. Objects began to speak alongside memory. Influence could travel farther than a voice. Bronze did not isolate Britain from its past. It layered new relationships on top of old ones. The land still mattered. The seasons still guided life. Yet beyond the hills, beyond the water, other lives now touched this one indirectly. The island became part of something wider without losing itself. The moment Britain touched metal, it touched the wider world. From that contact grew new identities, shaped not only by place, but by connection. Once trade existed, belonging began to stretch. People still knew where they came from, but now they also knew where things came from. Identity began to reach beyond the local, preparing Britain for a world where distance would matter as much as land beneath one's feet. This widening awareness quietly reshaped how people saw themselves, standing between tradition and exchange, grounded at home, yet connected outward through trust and movement together. As trade settled into daily life, Britain began to change in ways that were subtle but lasting. Exchange was not an activity separate from society. It became part of how society organized itself. Paths remembered movement. Relationships formed around reliability. Certain individuals emerged not because they claimed authority, but because others depended on them. These people were not merchants in the modern sense. They did not accumulate goods to display power. They became trusted because they remembered roots, honored timing, and returned when expected. Their value lay in consistency. When something needed to move, they knew how. When trust was required, they carried it carefully. Influence followed dependability, not ambition. Wealth in this world did not sit still. Objects were valuable because they traveled. A bronze blade gained meaning as it passed through hands, each exchange adding story rather than subtracting worth. To keep something moving was often more important than keeping it owned. Circulation sustained relationships. Hoarding weakened them. Along these routes, more than material passed. Styles of decoration appeared far from their origins. Ideas about ritual, burial, and display drifted quietly across regions. Even beliefs adjusted subtly as people encountered unfamiliar practices and folded them into their own. Britain did not become uniform. It became layered. This layering challenges the image of isolated groups cut off from one another. Instead, communities existed within overlapping networks. A person could belong locally while being connected distantly. Identity was no longer singular. It carried traces of contact, memory of exchange, echoes of elsewhere. Because trade relied on trust, it reshaped social expectations. Reliability became a form of status. To fail repeatedly meant exclusion. To succeed quietly meant influence. These dynamics were rarely spoken aloud. They were understood through pattern. People learned who could be depended upon and adjusted accordingly. Ritual adapted to this movement. Certain gatherings became moments for exchange, not only of goods, but of reaffirmation. Agreements were renewed through repetition rather than enforcement. Stories accompanied objects, explaining where they had been and why they mattered. Memory expanded outward, no longer confined to one valley or season. As connections multiplied, differences became clearer. Regions developed preferences, styles, and customs that distinguished them without dividing them. Exchange did not erase identity. It sharpened it. People learned who they were by encountering who they were not. Distinction grew alongside connection. This created a Britain that was neither fragmented nor unified. It was interwoven. Boundaries existed, but they were permeable. Movement flowed through them rather than stopping at them. The land held many cultures at once, linked by shared roots and mutual dependence. Late nights spent by fire now included stories of places unseen. Objects carried hints of distant landscapes. The world felt larger but not threatening. Familiar life continued, enriched by contact rather than disrupted by it. Exchange became a quiet teacher. Over time, these networks altered how people thought about belonging. A person could be rooted in place while participating in something broader. Identity stretched without breaking. Britain learned to hold difference within connection, preparing it for future changes that would test this balance. As trade continued to weave the land together, distinctions grew more visible. Certain groups leaned into particular styles. Certain routes gained greater importance. Influence clustered unevenly. Connection, once evenly spread, began to highlight differences in access and reach. With those differences came new forms of separation, subtle at first, but growing clearer as exchange continued to shape society. The first lines between people were not drawn on maps. They were felt in quieter ways, expressed through choice rather than command. As Britain's networks of exchange deepened, differences began to appear more clearly, not as barriers, but as signals. People started to show who they were, not by separating themselves, but by shaping their lives in slightly different directions. Burial practices shifted first. Some communities placed objects carefully beside the dead. Others emphasized position, orientation, or location. These choices were not random. They reflected values, memories, and shared understandings about life and continuity. To an outside eye, they might look like decoration. To those who practiced them, they were statements of belonging. Ornamentation followed similar paths. Styles of dress, jewelry, and tool design began to diverge across regions. Materials remained shared, but form changed. A pin shaped one way here appeared shaped differently there. These variations were not declarations of opposition. They were expressions of familiarity. People recognized themselves in patterns they returned to again and again. Settlement patterns also revealed distinction. Some groups favored clustered living. Others spread across wider ground. These choices reflected environment, history, and preference more than conflict. The land invited different responses, and communities answered in their own ways. Identity formed through adaptation rather than exclusion. What is striking is how gently these lines emerged. There were no proclamations, no enforced separations. Identity was not imposed from above. It grew from repetition. A style used often enough became characteristic. A ritual repeated long enough became defining. Over time, people began to recognize difference without needing to explain it. This recognition did not require hostility. Difference was not yet a threat. Exchange continued across regions. Objects still traveled. Stories still moved. Identity existed alongside connection, not against it. People could belong somewhere without rejecting elsewhere. Modern thinking often treats identity as something rigid, tied to borders and authority. But in this early Britain, identity was flexible. It could overlap. It could shift. A person might share customs with one group and practices with another. Belonging was layered, not exclusive. This ancient diversity challenges the idea that difference is a modern invention. Britain did not become varied through later migration alone. It was already varied, shaped by land, memory, and choice. Identity arrived long before nations, flags, or kings gave it names. Because identity was expressed rather than enforced, it remained adaptive. If conditions changed, practices could adjust. If connections deepened, styles could blend. The lines between groups were real, but they were soft. They guided recognition without demanding separation. Yet even soft lines shape behavior. As people recognized difference, they also began to protect it. Not aggressively, but attentively. Certain practices mattered more. Certain styles became meaningful markers. Identity, once expressed, sought continuity. This did not immediately lead to conflict. It led to care. People invested in what defined them. They remembered why certain choices mattered. Over time, this investment created attachment. Attachment, in turn, created vulnerability. What mattered could be threatened. The tools to defend identity did not appear overnight. They developed gradually alongside the identities themselves. Protection began as preservation. Certain ways were guarded by repetition, by teaching, by expectation. These were the earliest forms of boundary, carried in behavior rather than enforced by force. Britain at this stage was neither divided nor unified. It was articulated. Difference existed without domination. Identity lived in practice, not proclamation. These early lines between people were not walls, they were threads woven into daily life. As bronze continued to circulate and identities continued to sharpen, the balance would begin to change. What started as expression would invite defense. What was once soft would slowly firm. The next chapter follows that shift, as tools meant to shape life also gained the power to protect it, and sometimes to threaten it. Iron did not arrive with ceremony. It did not glitter like bronze or announce connection to distant places. It appeared quietly, drawn from ground that lay close at hand. What made iron different was not its strength alone, but its availability. For the first time, communities could shape their own tools without waiting for materials to arrive from far beyond the horizon. This altered the balance that bronze had created. Power no longer flowed mainly along long routes of exchange. It settled closer to home. Knowledge spread outward instead of inward. The ability to produce iron rested with those who understood their own land, their own soil, their own fire. Authority began to fragment, not collapse, but divide into smaller centers. Iron tools changed daily life first. Fields could be worked more efficiently. Clearing land required less cooperation across distance and more effort within a single territory. Farming deepened. Settlements became more stable because they could sustain themselves without constant exchange. The future narrowed slightly, focusing attention on what lay nearby. This shift encouraged independence. Communities relied less on distant partners and more on local skill. What you could make mattered more than what you could obtain. Knowledge that had once been rare became shared. Ironworking spread because it could. It did not need permission from trade networks to exist. With this independence came a change in how people thought about control. Land mattered more, not as property in a modern sense, but as resource and responsibility. The ground that provided iron now supported identity and survival. To know your land was to know your strength. Defense followed naturally. When production is local, loss is personal. Iron tools made it easier to protect fields, settlements, and routes. This did not immediately create constant conflict. It created awareness. Communities became more attentive to boundaries that had once been soft. Iron also changed how power looked. Influence was no longer concentrated among those who managed exchange. It spread among those who managed production. Authority became quieter and more numerous. Instead of few voices guiding many, many voices guided themselves. This decentralization reshaped relationships. Cooperation still existed, but it was chosen rather than required. Trade continued, but it no longer defined survival. Communities could stand alone if needed. This possibility altered behavior even when it was not tested. Warfare did not dominate this period, but it became more feasible. Iron made tools adaptable. The same material shaped plows and blades. The line between labor and defense thinned. Preparedness became part of daily life, not an exception. Yet the tone of this change was not sudden or violent. It unfolded gradually, as iron became familiar. Old networks adjusted rather than vanished. Bronze did not disappear overnight. It lingered, valued for certain uses, but its influence waned as iron took hold. What mattered most was how iron reshaped importance. Those who once mattered because they connected others now shared influence with those who produced. Knowledge mattered differently. Practical skill gained weight alongside ritual understanding. Authority became more grounded. This grounded power made communities more resilient, but also more inward-looking. Identity tightened around place. Belonging became linked to land worked and defended rather than routes traveled. The world felt smaller, but more controllable. Iron rewrote power without announcing itself. It did not topple leaders or erase traditions. It shifted attention. It rewarded local knowledge. It made strength more accessible and influence more distributed. As iron settled into Britain, identities began to narrow. Not in hostility, but in focus. People defined themselves more clearly by where they lived and what they could sustain. With localized power came localized identity, preparing the ground for groups to see themselves not just as participants in a network, but as distinct communities shaped by land, labor, and shared defense. Iron Age Britain did not divide itself neatly. The word tribe feels solid, fixed, certain, yet the lives it tries to describe were anything but. Long before Roman writers arrived with their categories, identity here was fluid, situational, and responsive to moment and need. People gathered and separated according to season, opportunity, and obligation. Alliances formed around shared work, shared ritual, shared risk. They dissolved when circumstances changed. Loyalty was not sworn permanently to land or leader. It shifted with marriage, migration, and necessity. Belonging was something negotiated repeatedly, not inherited once. Roman observers struggled with this. Trained to see power as bounded and hierarchical, they searched for clear groups to name and control. They labeled what they saw, freezing movement into structure. In doing so, they created tribes that appeared stable on the page but were flexible in life. In reality, these identities overlapped constantly. A person might farm with one group, trade with another, gather seasonally with a third. There was no contradiction in this. Identity was relational. It existed between people, not within borders. To belong was to participate. This flexibility reduced the need for constant conflict. Warfare occurred, but it was not the defining condition. More often, groups negotiated access, displayed strength without violence, or resolved tension through exchange. Boundaries were understood, but rarely absolute. Crossing them did not always provoke hostility. Display mattered more than domination. Feasts, gifts, and gatherings allowed groups to assert presence without bloodshed. Strength was shown, not constantly tested. Reputation traveled faster than armies. Knowing who could be trusted, who should be respected, who required caution mattered more than controlling territory. Seasonal gatherings reinforced this pattern. At certain times of year, people assembled beyond daily settlements. These moments allowed alliances to renew and shift. Marriages formed bridges. Stories aligned memory. Disputes softened under shared ritual. The social landscape breathed. Roman accounts often mistook this movement for instability. They saw change and assumed weakness. They saw negotiation and assumed indecision. Yet flexibility was precisely what allowed these societies to endure. When pressure arrived, identities could adjust rather than break. The idea of fixed tribes made later history easier to tell. It simplified conquest, resistance, and rule. But it obscured how people actually lived. Iron Age Britain was not a patchwork of sealed groups. It was a web of relationships constantly maintained. Understanding this reframes power. Authority did not rest in controlling land alone. It rested in maintaining connections. Those who navigated relationships skillfully mattered most. Influence came from mediation, not command. This relational identity left little trace for historians trained to look for borders. It survives instead in hints of shared styles, overlapping practices, and repeated gathering places. These are the shadows of a social world that refused to stand still. As identities interacted and adapted, belief followed naturally. Shared rituals, sacred places, and seasonal meaning reinforced connection beyond practicality. Where people recognized belonging, they also recognized significance. Identity prepared the ground for belief, setting the stage for spiritual systems shaped by relationship rather than rule. These beliefs did not demand uniform agreement. They allowed variation, adaptation, and quiet disagreement without collapse. Sacred meaning flowed through shared action rather than enforced doctrine. This made belief resilient, able to survive change without shattering. As iron tools anchored people more firmly to place, these relational beliefs settled deeper into landscape. Groves, rivers, and meeting grounds gathered layered significance. What had begun as flexible identity now carried spiritual weight. This weight would soon attract attention from outside forces trained to categorize, record, and command. When written systems later arrived, they would struggle to capture this fluid world. The tension between living belief and written order was already forming, unseen but inevitable, waiting for contact with authorities who preferred lines that stayed still. Those pressures would eventually harden identities, transforming relationships into categories, and setting the stage for profound misunderstandings yet to come across later centuries. Belief in Iron Age. Britain did not rise toward the sky. It settled into the land itself. Rivers were not scenery, but presence, moving with intention and memory. Hills did not merely stand, they watched. Groves gathered silence in ways that felt deliberate. The sacred was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, encountered through movement and attention. People did not approach these places to ask favors from unseen beings. They approached to acknowledge relationship. A river received offerings not as payment, but as greeting. A blade placed in water marked respect, recognition, and continuity. What mattered was not what was given, but the act of giving itself, repeated carefully across generations. These gestures were conversations carried out without words. The land responded not through miracles, but through reliability. A crossing remained safe. A harvest returned. A path stayed open. When things went wrong, meaning was sought not in punishment, but in imbalance. Something had shifted. Attention needed adjustment. This form of belief required presence rather than instruction. There were no texts to memorize, no creeds to recite. Understanding came from watching how places behaved over time. Children learned which hills demanded quiet, which waters invited pause, which groves required care. Knowledge passed through experience rather than explanation. Because belief lived in place, it varied subtly across Britain. One valley honored water more deeply. Another held hills as central. These differences did not conflict. They reflected relationship. Each community responded to the land it knew best. Shared patterns existed, but they allowed variation without fracture. Offerings were not spectacles. They were simple, deliberate acts woven into daily life. Food, tools, and crafted objects entered rivers and earth quietly. Nothing about these moments suggested fear. They suggested conversation continued. Life and land remained in balance. This spirituality did not separate sacred time from ordinary time. Work, travel, and ritual blended naturally. A journey passed through meaning without stopping. A task carried intention without ceremony. The sacred did not interrupt life. It underlined it. Because belief was embedded rather than declared, it left few symbols that demanded interpretation. Later observers would struggle to name it. Without gods clearly defined, without temples enclosed, it appeared incomplete. Yet its strength lay in this openness. It adapted because it was relational, not fixed. Those who understood the land deeply became guides within this system. Not priests in the later sense, but listeners. They noticed shifts others missed. They remembered stories tied to place. Their influence came from alignment rather than authority. When they spoke, it was because attention was needed. This quiet influence did not elevate them above others. It positioned them within the web of relationship. They were accountable to outcomes. If guidance failed, trust moved elsewhere. The sacred did not protect status. It demanded accuracy. Over time, this shared belief shaped how people moved through Britain. Paths avoided certain places. Gatherings formed around others. The landscape became textured with meaning invisible to outsiders, but immediately felt by those within it. Memory attached to stone, water, and soil without ever hardening into doctrine. Because nothing was fixed in text, belief could travel forward in time without breaking. It survived mistakes, absorbed newcomers, and adjusted to altered conditions. Sacred meaning did not collapse when details changed. It shifted, preserving balance rather than rules. This flexibility explains why echoes of these beliefs persisted quietly, long after later systems tried to replace them with words alone. Even silence carried memory forward when practice continued without interruption across generations and landscapes. They did not worship above the world. They worshipped within it. Meaning was not imposed on the land. It was discovered through attention. This allowed belief to endure change. When new materials arrived, when identities shifted, when pressure increased, the sacred remained because it lived in relationship rather than rule. As Iron Age Britain continued to evolve, this embedded spirituality quietly shaped power. Those who understood the landscape held influence without claiming it. Knowledge of place guided decision and timing. In this way, belief prepared the ground for authority rooted in understanding rather than command, setting the stage for tensions that would soon arise when outside powers encountered a sacred world that refused to be written down. Long before they were wrapped in legend, the Druids were known for something quieter. They were keepers of knowing. In a world without pages, they carried memory across generations, trained to listen, recall, and repeat without distortion. Their presence was practical, not theatrical, rooted in responsibility rather than mystery, guiding communities through time, change, and uncertainty with care, patience, discipline, humility, and deliberate restraint alone. Their training was long and demanding, built on listening more than speaking. Knowledge was memorized through rhythm, story, and repetition, refined over years until recall became instinctive. Law was not written but remembered, enforced through consensus and example. To forget was failure. To remember accurately was service offered quietly, carrying weight without display or reward earned through discipline, patience, and unwavering communal responsibility daily together. Druids functioned as educators, shaping minds rather than commanding bodies. Young learners observed, practiced, and listened for years before speaking publicly. Wisdom was measured by restraint, not volume. Those who knew the most spoke the least. Teaching unfolded through shared tasks, ritual timing, and careful correction, ensuring knowledge survived change without becoming rigid or fragile across generations, landscapes, seasons, relationships, challenges, and shifting circumstances gracefully. They also served as mediators, called upon when disputes threatened balance. Rather than issuing judgment, they recalled precedent, memory, and outcome. Past resolutions guided present decisions. This reliance on remembered experience prevented authority from hardening into domination. Justice remained flexible, rooted in restoration rather than punishment, preserving cohesion within communities bound more by trust than force through patience, dialogue, continuity, empathy, accountability, and shared obligation. Their authority depended entirely on accuracy. A misremembered cycle or mistimed ritual could damage crops, trust, or unity. Failure carried consequence. There was no protection in title, no inherited immunity. Knowledge demanded constant renewal. This pressure shaped discipline. Memory was tested, challenged, and refined continually, ensuring those who guided did so through proven understanding, not assumption earned by experience, repetition, humility, and long observation alone. Later centuries misunderstood this system, mistaking oral authority for secrecy. Roman writers described Druids as enigmatic, dangerous, or subversive because their power resisted documentation. A memory-based order cannot be easily catalogued or controlled. Its influence survives without permission. This unsettled empire is built on record, decree, and written obedience, revealing a form of power that escaped administrative grasp through continuity, practice, shared trust, quiet resilience alone. Druids were not separate from society. They lived among those they served, bound by the same risks and seasons. Their knowledge did not elevate them beyond consequence. It increased responsibility. When memory guided action, failure affected everyone. This shared vulnerability kept authority grounded, preventing separation between knower and community, reinforcing trust through mutual dependence and visible accountability maintained across generations, practices, challenges, and inevitable change. Training demanded years because forgetting carried risk. Students learned entire genealogies, seasonal markers, and legal precedents without reference. Memory became landscape within the mind. This internal archive allowed guidance anywhere, anytime, without tools. Knowledge traveled lightly, immune to loss by fire or theft. Resilient precisely because it lived only through people moving between voices, gatherings, rituals, journeys, seasons, and lifetimes without written anchors or monuments. Their greatest tool was not magic, it was memory, disciplined and refined beyond spectacle. This memory preserved law, belief, and history simultaneously. It shaped identity without fixing it, guided behavior without command. Through recall, the Druids held past and future together, creating continuity strong enough to endure upheaval without ever needing to be written down across centuries, cultures, landscapes, transitions, and silent transformations unseen enduring. Such memory-based authority unsettled written empires because it could not be seized. It required listening, not orders. When Rome encountered this system, it sensed a threat beneath the calm. Memory that organizes people without records resists control. This tension would soon sharpen, as imperial power confronted knowledge that lived, breathed, and remembered beyond reach, setting the stage for conflict between memory and written authority inevitably. Rome did not misunderstand the Druids. It understood them too well. What Roman writers recorded about these figures was not neutral description, but political framing. Every word carried purpose. Every accusation served control. When Rome spoke of Druids as dangerous, secretive, or subversive, it was not reacting to superstition. It was responding to influence it could not command. The Roman world depended on writing. Law, tax, rank, citizenship, and authority all moved through documents. Power lived on tablets, scrolls, and decrees. To rule was to record. To exist officially was to be written down. Anything that organized people outside this system appeared unstable, even threatening. The Druids represented precisely that problem. They held law without texts, history without archives, and authority without office. Their influence moved through memory and ritual rather than command. Rome could not audit it. It could not copy it. It could not easily replace it. This made it dangerous in a way weapons were not. Roman accounts describe Druids gathering crowds, shaping belief, and guiding decisions. From an imperial perspective, this looked like parallel governance. Not rebellion, but something more unsettling. A system that did not need Rome to function. A structure that could persist even if Roman rule withdrew. Rome did not fear the content of Druid belief. It feared the method. Oral authority could adapt faster than written law. It could survive the loss of leaders. It could reorganize quietly. Written systems break when records are destroyed. Memory-based systems move on. This is why Roman suppression targeted Druids specifically. Not farmers, not craftsmen, not even warriors to the same degree. The effort was focused on those who preserved continuity beyond Roman reach. Cutting memory disrupted cohesion, removed the keepers of knowing, and the society became easier to fragment. Roman narratives framed this as civilizing effort. By casting Druids as barbaric or irrational, suppression could be justified as progress. Yet beneath this language sat a clear strategy. Replace memory with record. Replace ritual timing with calendars. Replace relational authority with administrative hierarchy. Rome did not arrive intending to erase Britain. It arrived to manage it. Management required predictability. Predictability required documentation. Druids represented unpredictability not because they were chaotic, but because they were self-sustaining. This reframing shifts how Roman conquest is understood. The conflict was not simply military or cultural, it was epistemological. Two systems of knowing confronted each other. One relied on permanence through writing, the other relied on continuity through practice. Only one could dominate fully. Roman writers described Druids as refusing to write knowledge down. This was interpreted as secrecy or fear. In reality, it was protection. Knowledge kept in people cannot be seized. It must be learned. And learning requires time, trust, and participation. Rome had little patience for that. By dismantling Druid networks, Rome weakened Britain's internal coherence without needing constant force. Communities still functioned, but guidance fragmented. Memory thinned. Authority shifted toward written systems Rome controlled. This was efficient rule, not blind destruction. What makes this moment unsettling is how familiar it feels. History often survives in the language of those who won. Roman texts became the lens through which Druids were remembered. Their portrayal shaped centuries of misunderstanding. Power wrote the narrative, and memory was reduced to rumor. Rome did not destroy Druids because they were primitive. It targeted them because they represented a sophisticated alternative to written rule, an authority that lived beyond reach, an influence that could not be stamped, taxed, or archived. Understanding this reveals Rome's strategy in Britain more clearly. Conquest was not about replacement. It was about management. About transforming how people remembered, organized, and deferred authority. The land would remain. The people would remain. But the system guiding them would change. As Roman power settled in, Britain did not vanish. It adjusted. Roman roads, towns, and laws layered over older patterns. But beneath that surface, something quieter persisted. Rome arrived not to replace Britain, but to manage it, unaware that memory has ways of surviving control, waiting patiently beneath the weight of written rule. When Rome moved against the Druids, it did not erase them in a single moment. Silence spread instead. Knowledge that had once moved openly through teaching and ritual withdrew into quieter spaces. What could not be spoken publicly learned how to hide in plain sight. Survival did not announce itself. It adapted. Druidic knowledge did not vanish because it was never contained in one place. It lived in habits, gestures, and seasonal expectation. When formal gatherings ended, fragments continued through ordinary life. Planting followed remembered rhythms. Festivals shifted names but kept their timing. Rural customs carried echoes of older understanding without needing explanation. Stories became safer than instruction. Folklore absorbed memory that could no longer be taught directly. Tales of spirits, hills, and hidden places preserved awareness of landscape and caution. What sounded like superstition to outsiders functioned as guidance to those who listened carefully. Meaning survived by wearing unfamiliar clothing. Seasonal celebrations endured with remarkable resilience. Fires still marked transitions. Processions still traced old paths. Communities gathered when they always had, even if the reasons were spoken differently. The calendar changed on paper, but not always in practice. People continued to move through time as they had learned. Language softened what power could not reach. Proverbs replaced law. Custom replaced command. Knowledge traveled in forms that resisted scrutiny because they appeared harmless. A habit repeated long enough no longer needed justification. It simply became the way things were done. Rural life proved especially protective. Far from administrative centers, old practices blended naturally with new rules. Fields followed older patterns. Boundaries remembered ancient decisions. The land itself carried instruction for those who knew how to read it. Silence preserved what attention alone could keep alive. This survival was not triumphant. There were no victories recorded. Much was lost. Lineages of teaching broke. Depth thinned. Precision faded. Yet enough remained to influence behavior long after its origins were forgotten. The shape endured even as detail dissolved. Later generations would practice rituals without knowing why. They would repeat sayings without remembering their source. This forgetting was not failure. It was camouflage. What survived longest did so by becoming ordinary. When knowledge stops demanding recognition, it avoids destruction. Rome underestimated this quiet persistence. Written authority assumes absence when it finds no record. But absence in text does not equal absence in life. Memory slipped beneath notice, carried by repetition rather than resistance. It did not oppose Rome directly. It waited. Over time, elements of Druidic thought blended into emerging belief systems. Christianity arrived not into emptiness, but into a landscape already shaped by reverence and rhythm. New meanings attached themselves to old places. Sacred wells became holy springs. Seasonal observances gained new stories. Continuity hid beneath change. This layering allowed Britain to absorb new authority without losing its deeper patterns. People learned new words for old feelings. They followed new rules while maintaining older relationships with land and season. Adaptation ensured survival where confrontation would have failed. What remained was not a system, but a sensibility. Attention to place, respect for timing. Awareness that life moved in cycles larger than any ruler. These ideas did not need Druids to persist. They had already entered practice. This is why echoes of pre-Roman belief appear unexpectedly in later centuries. They surface in folk songs, rural customs, and local traditions that resist explanation. They do not trace cleanly back to origin. They do not announce lineage. They simply remain. Silence protected what force could not. Memory that bends endures longer than memory that stands rigid. By withdrawing, adapting, and embedding itself in daily life, Druidic knowledge survived conquest without record. It changed shape, but not purpose. As Rome now steps fully onto the stage, Britain appears transformed on the surface. Roads spread, towns rise, administration settles in. Yet beneath this visible order, something older still breathes. Memory waits patiently, carried by land and habit, prepared to outlast empires that believe silence means surrender. Rome did not arrive as an ending. It arrived as an overlay. While later stories often focus on legions and battles, most of Britain experienced Roman rule not as sudden destruction, but as gradual rearrangement. Roads appeared where paths already existed. Towns rose where people already gathered. Authority shifted above daily life, not through it. The Roman presence concentrated itself in specific places. Forts, villas, and administrative centers marked nodes of control rather than total occupation. These spaces mattered deeply to Rome, but they did not reach everywhere. Beyond their edges, Britain continued much as it always had. Fields were worked, seasons returned. Local customs persisted without interference. Taxes changed how surplus moved, but not how life was lived. Coin entered circulation in towns, yet barter and obligation remained strong in rural areas. Written law mattered in courts, but custom still guided daily decisions. Rome governed efficiently where it could see and loosely where it could not. This created a layered Britain. On the surface, Roman order appeared firm. Roads cut straight lines through land. Stone buildings announced permanence. Latin words named offices and ranks. Yet beneath this structure, older rhythms endured. The land did not forget its patterns simply because it was renamed. Rural communities felt Rome mostly at a distance. A census might pass through. A levy might be collected. But daily life remained anchored in relationships older than empire. People adapted to new requirements without surrendering identity. Rome did not replace Britain. It managed it. Even Roman towns were not purely Roman. Local labor built them. Local traditions shaped how they functioned. Roman styles blended with existing practices, creating something neither fully imported nor fully native. Cultural exchange flowed both ways, even if Rome recorded it as one-directional. This coexistence often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama. There was no single moment when Britain became Roman. Change accumulated slowly. A road made travel easier. A market altered trade. A fort brought new faces. None of this erased what came before. It layered over it. Roman administration depended on stability. Destroying local systems would have been inefficient. It was easier to adapt existing structures than to eliminate them. Village leaders became intermediaries. Old boundaries guided new districts. The empire learned Britain as much as it governed it. This is why Roman Britain does not feel uniform. Some regions appear heavily Romanized. Others barely changed. Variation was not failure, it was strategy. Rome ruled differently depending on resistance, value, and distance. Control did not require sameness. The idea of conquest as total transformation comes from later storytelling. It simplifies history into clean breaks, but lived experience is rarely that neat. For most people, Rome was an added layer of obligation, not a replacement of world. Britain's resilience lay in its ability to absorb without dissolving. Old beliefs adjusted. Old customs adapted. Memory continued quietly beneath new names. Rome did not notice what it could not catalog, and much of Britain lived beyond its attention. Empires leave marks, but not always roots. Roads endure. Ruins remain. Yet the deeper structures of life persist where empires do not reach. Roman Britain was governed, taxed, and recorded, but it was never emptied of its past. As Rome settled in, it created an illusion of permanence. Stone suggested eternity. Records implied control. But beneath the surface, Britain remained Britain. The land remembered older ways. People practiced them quietly. Rome ruled effectively, but it never fully replaced what it ruled. This tension between visible control and quiet continuity defines the Roman presence. Britain learned how to live under empire without losing itself. That skill would matter deeply when Rome eventually withdrew, leaving behind marks that endured, but roots that never fully took hold, preparing the land for what would follow next. Britain did not choose between worlds. It learned how to inhabit more than one at the same time. In daylight, Roman order shaped movement and obligation. Roads guided travel. Coins changed hands. Latin names echoed in markets and courts. Authority felt visible and structured. Yet beneath this surface, older rhythms continued without conflict. Seasonal practices returned quietly. Fields followed ancestral timing. Belief remained rooted in place. This was not resistance. It was flexibility. People adjusted behavior without abandoning identity, allowing two systems to occupy the same lives. Roman by day, ancestral by season, Britain became skilled at balance, carrying one set of rules in public and another in memory, moving between them without fracture or confusion. With patience learned over generations, through quiet practice repeated endlessly across changing years together. In towns, Roman life unfolded with confidence. Baths steamed. Law was spoken aloud. Records were kept. Yet these spaces represented only part of Britain. Beyond stone walls, life moved differently. People stepped between worlds without ceremony. A farmer might honor Roman demands in one moment, then observe ancestral customs the next. Nothing about this felt divided. It felt complete. Identity layered rather than replaced. Roman tools served daily needs, while older meanings guided seasonal return. This coexistence allowed continuity without confrontation. Britain did not need to reject Rome to remain itself. It learned instead to absorb, translate, and continue, shaping a culture that could carry multiple truths without collapse or contradiction. Flexibility became survival, practiced quietly across households, villages, and generations over long spans of time without declaration or record. This dual existence shaped thought as much as habit. People learned when to show allegiance and when to remain invisible. Roman festivals passed, yet older observances waited patiently for their season. Sacred places accepted new names while retaining old meaning. Nothing was erased. It was reframed. Memory adjusted without breaking. Children grew up fluent in both worlds, understanding which rules applied where. This fluency reduced tension and prevented rupture. It allowed Britain to survive occupation without losing coherence. Rather than standing in opposition, life flowed around authority, preserving continuity through adaptation rather than defiance. Such balance required awareness, patience, and restraint. Qualities refined through daily experience rather than ideology or formal instruction, and passed quietly between generations as part of ordinary living within shared homes, fields, paths, seasons, work, memory. This layered identity confused later historians searching for clarity. Records prefer singular stories. Britain offered none. It lived in overlap. Roman withdrawal did not signal collapse because older systems were already intact. The empire's presence had altered surfaces, not foundations. When authority eventually thinned, life adjusted again. The same flexibility that allowed coexistence allowed continuity. Britain had practiced transition for generations, moving between frameworks without losing itself. What looked like disappearance was often simply shift, unseen by those expecting endings. Duality became instinct, enabling communities to endure uncertainty without panic, meeting change as something familiar rather than catastrophic. Years of adaptation trained Britain to survive transition as a condition of life, rather than an event requiring rupture or finality within shared memory and practice across generations, seasons, and places together. This ability to live between worlds shaped what came next. Rome's power depended on presence and record. When that presence faded, Britain did not need to reinvent itself. It simply leaned back toward what had never fully gone. The empire's departure would feel quieter than its arrival, precisely because life had never rested entirely on it. Eventually, Rome withdraws, leaving marks on the land but not command over memory, and Britain moves forward, carrying both worlds behind it. This closing tension prepares the ground for understanding withdrawal not as collapse, but as transition already rehearsed, having been lived daily through centuries of layered existence where authority passed overhead while continuity remained below, waiting quietly within land, habit, and memory until the moment demanded return without noise or declaration of ending. When Rome withdrew from Britain, it did not arrive as disaster. Orders stopped coming. Pay ended. Officials left their posts quietly, one by one. The machinery of empire slowed, then stalled. There was no final battle, no single date to mark the end. Administration faded, and with it, the reach of distant authority. For most people, life did not collapse. It narrowed. Roman goods remained in use until they broke. Roads still guided travel. Walls still stood. Coins circulated until they were lost or worn smooth. People adapted to absence the same way they had adapted to presence. Local systems absorbed the change. Villages leaned more heavily on custom. Leadership shifted toward those already trusted. Written law lost relevance where it could no longer be enforced. Memory filled the gaps administration left behind. Roman tools continued to shape work and building. Stone remained where it had been placed. Skills learned under empire did not vanish. They became simply tools, stripped of imperial meaning. What endured was usefulness, not allegiance. This quieter ending unsettles expectation. We are taught to look for collapse in flames and moisu, but most endings are administrative. When systems stop supporting daily life, people adjust. They do not mourn institutions the way historians do. As Roman presence thinned, Britain grew quieter, not emptier. Trade narrowed, travel slowed, horizons shrank gently. Communities turned inward without fear. What had always sustained them resumed central place. Without records to maintain, memory regained weight. Stories aligned behavior. Custom guided justice. The land once again taught lessons. Writing had tried to replace. Continuity returned through habit rather than decree. Rome's departure did not create darkness. It created quiet. Towns emptied slowly. Some were reused. Others faded. None signaled catastrophe to those living nearby. Change felt manageable because it was familiar. This moment matters because it reshapes how we understand endings. Britain did not fall when Rome left. It adjusted. What narrowed could widen again. What faded left space for older forms to return. Empires fall loudly, but life continues softly. Fields were still planted. Children still learned paths. Belief remained close to ground and season. Britain moved forward without ceremony, carrying layers learned through centuries of adaptation. This quiet endurance prepared Britain for the next transformation. Without Rome's records, memory thinned further. New stories would soon fill the space, shaping identity through forgetting as much as recall. Silence does not mean absence. It means transition unfolding beyond notice. As administration withdrew, something else approached, subtle and unnamed, ready to reinterpret what remained. Later centuries would call this a dark age, mistaking unwritten life for loss. But people living through it felt continuity more than collapse. The old world had not ended. It had simply become quieter. This narrowing set conditions for forgetting. Not erasure, but fading. Without records, memory softened. Details dissolved. Patterns remained. Into this softened space stepped new names, new rulers, and new explanations. The land endured all of it. Paths waited. Fields remembered. Rivers carried meaning forward without comment. Britain prepared quietly for another kind of forgetting, one that would arrive not through force, but through writing. This transition would feel different from Roman rule. It would reshape memory itself. The next era would not conquer with armies, but with stories chosen and recorded. Into this quiet steps another kind of forgetting, slower and more permanent, where what is written survives, and what is lived must find new ways to endure. This moment closes Rome's chapter not with noise, but with narrowing horizons and steady breath. Life continues, patient and adaptable, waiting for the next story to be told. The end of empire passes without ceremony, leaving space rather than ruin. What fills that space will redefine history itself. Britain stands between eras, unchanged at its core, altered at its edges, carrying memory forward into uncertainty. This quiet ending invites us to listen more closely to what follows. Nothing ends here. It merely changes form, preparing the ground for what comes next. The silence is not empty. It is waiting. In that waiting, history learns how to forget. Another story begins just beyond the edge of record. This is where written memory will soon intervene. Quietly, decisively, forever, again. The Dark Ages did not feel dark to those living through them. Darkness arrived later, when historians looked back and found fewer words than they expected. What they mistook for collapse was often silence. What they called emptiness was simply unwritten life, continuing beyond the reach of record. After Rome withdrew, Britain did not fall apart. It adjusted. Archaeology tells this story quietly, through repaired buildings, reused materials, and settlements that shrink without vanishing. Life became more local, more varied, and less uniform. That variation has often been misread as decline, because it does not fit the shape of empire. Without centralized administration, Britain returned to regional rhythms. Some areas maintained trade connections. Others turned inward. Farming adapted to local conditions. Crafts continued with available materials. Skills did not disappear. They narrowed, focusing on what mattered most. This was not decay. It was specialization shaped by circumstance. The idea of darkness emerges when we expect continuity of documentation. Rome wrote extensively. What followed did not. Without records, later centuries assumed absence. Yet people were still building, farming, trading, and believing. They simply did not record these acts in ways that survived. Archaeological layers reveal continuity where texts fall silent. Post-Roman communities reused Roman stone, maintained roads selectively, and adapted structures to new needs. There is no widespread evidence of abandonment or panic. Instead, there is patience. Materials are conserved. Space is repurposed. Life carries on with restraint. Regional variation becomes more pronounced during this period. This is often mistaken for fragmentation. In reality, it reflects autonomy. Communities responded to local needs rather than imperial standards. What looks uneven on a map looks practical on the ground. The absence of large monuments from this era has reinforced the myth of collapse. But monument building requires surplus and centralized authority. Neither was necessary for survival. The lack of new stone structures says more about priorities than capability. People invested in life, not display. Darkness, then, becomes a projection. It is the shadow cast by missing texts. When writing thins, Historians grow uncomfortable. Silence invites assumption. Yet silence can also mean stability, so ordinary it does not demand record. This period was not static. Change continued. Trade routes shifted. New materials appeared. Cultural practices evolved. What changed was scale, not existence. Britain moved from empire-wide systems to regional networks, trading reach for resilience. Later writers imposed the label Dark Ages to explain what they could not see. But archaeology sees continuity where chronicles do not. Fields were worked, tools were made, children learned skills, belief adapted quietly. Nothing suggests a society in despair. Understanding this reframes how we see the centuries between Rome and medieval kingdoms. They were not an intermission. They were a transition lived without narration. Life does not pause when history stops writing. The myth of darkness also obscures innovation. New forms of art, craft, and social organization emerged during this time. They simply did not align with Roman or later medieval tastes. Because they were different, they were overlooked. The Dark Ages were never dark. They were unwritten. Life continued in forms that resisted easy classification. Memory carried what text did not. Custom guided what law no longer could. Britain lived on, adaptive and alert. This matters because it prepares us to see what comes next clearly. When new groups appear in the record, they are often framed as replacements. In truth, they enter a landscape already alive and changing. They do not arrive to erase. They arrive to merge. The silence of this period does not mark an end. It marks a pause in narration. Beneath it, life moved steadily forward, preparing the ground for new identities shaped not by collapse, but by continuity. To understand what follows, we must let go of darkness and listen for movement instead. New names will soon appear in the record, not because life began again, but because writing returned. And when it does, it will tell only part of the story. The rest must still be felt. Migration into Britain did not arrive as a wave crashing ashore. It came as footsteps, finding space. Small groups, settled near rivers and fields already known, drawn by familiarity rather than conquest. Homes were built beside older paths. Fields were worked alongside existing ones. What followed was not replacement, but adjustment, slow enough to feel ordinary. These newcomers are later called Saxons and Angles, but names came after the fact. At the time, people recognized neighbors, not categories. They brought tools, habits, and stories that mingled with what was already there. Britain had done this before. Absorption was not weakness. It was experience. Settlement unfolded over generations. Families arrived, intermarried, learned local seasons, and adapted to land that shaped everyone equally. Customs blended where they overlapped and persisted where they mattered. Language shifted gradually, not through decree, but through use. Old words faded. New ones settled in. Meaning followed practice. Archaeology supports this quieter picture. There is little sign of widespread destruction. Instead, there are reused sites, blended burial practices, and continuity in farming. Change appears uneven because it was negotiated locally. Some regions adopted new styles quickly. Others retained older ways longer. This variation reflects choice, not collapse. Power during this period remained local. Without centralized authority, communities decided how much to adopt and how much to retain. Newcomers did not impose a single identity. They adjusted to what worked. Survival favored cooperation. Conflict occurred, but it did not define the era. Britain's ability to absorb newcomers rested on shared needs. Everyone required land, food, and safety. Shared work created shared interest. Over time, distinctions softened. What began as difference became familiarity. The past did not vanish, it mixed. This blending challenges invasion narratives because it lacks spectacle. There were no clear endings to point to, no single turning points. Instead, there was continuity reshaped by contact. Britain did not fall, it absorbed. As identities blended, belief began to shift again. New traditions entered alongside older reverence for land and season. Sacred places gained additional meanings rather than losing their old ones. Christianity would later frame this change more sharply. But even now, belief moved through overlap. What survived was not purity, but adaptability. Britain's strength lay in its capacity to incorporate without erasing. Each arrival added layers. Memory adjusted. Practice continued. This period prepared Britain for the return of writing. When records resume, they capture names and rulers, but miss the blending that made them possible. By the time Chronicles speak clearly again, the work of merging worlds is already complete. Understanding this reframes migration as participation rather than invasion. People came, stayed, and became part of Britain. The land shaped them as it shaped everyone else. As belief systems continue to evolve, older patterns persist beneath new language. The next change will focus not on who arrived, but on how meaning itself is recorded and guided, setting the stage for belief to reorganize under new authority. This blending also altered daily rhythm. Meals combined habits. Tools were shared. Songs borrowed phrases and returned them changed. Children learned multiple ways to name the same hill and accepted both. Over time, difference became background, not boundary. Britain learned to live with layered memory, where origin mattered less than usefulness. This quiet mixing did not erase tension, but it lowered its temperature. Disputes were settled locally. Alliances shifted with harvest and marriage. No single story dominated. The land held them all. By the time writing sharpened categories, life had already practiced ambiguity. That practice would matter when belief sought structure and authority sought clarity. It allowed communities to remain flexible when pressure increased, choosing adaptation over purity, patience over force, and shared survival over rigid identity. A habit formed quietly that would guide Britain through the next transformation. When belief systems reorganized, and memory met written power again in seasons of change and uncertainty ahead for generations to come thereafter. Christianity did not arrive in Britain as a clean division between old and new. It moved slowly, carried by travelers, monks, and local converts who understood the land they stepped into. There was no sudden abandonment of earlier belief, no sharp moment when one world ended and another began. Instead, meanings overlapped, folded together, and adjusted over time. Sacred places did not disappear. They were renamed. Springs that had long been honored became holy wells. Hills once associated with seasonal gathering gained saints and stories. Paths already worn by ritual processions continued to be walked, now framed by new language. The land did not resist this change because it was not asked to forget. It was asked to speak differently. For those living through it, Christianity often felt less like replacement and more like translation. Older rhythms of time remained intact. Festivals shifted emphasis but kept their season. Fires still marked transition. Silence still gathered in familiar places. What changed was explanation, not experience. This blending was practical. New belief systems spread more easily when they respected what already mattered. Early Christian teachers understood this, whether by intention or instinct. They did not uproot devotion, they redirected it. Reverence for land became reverence for creation. Cycles of season found meaning within a broader narrative. Conflict existed, but it was not constant or universal. Many communities adopted Christian practice gradually, selecting elements that fit existing life. Belief was lived more than debated. People did not weigh doctrines against one another in abstraction. They tested meaning through daily practice. This gradual adoption explains why so much continuity remains visible. Older customs persist beneath Christian form, especially in rural areas. Practices that survived conquest and migration proved equally capable of surviving conversion. Adaptability had become instinct. Written texts began to matter again during this period. Monasteries preserved scripture, law, and memory. Writing returned as a tool of authority, but it entered a landscape already shaped by oral tradition. The result was not erasure, but layering. Written belief settled atop lived belief, influencing it without fully replacing it. This created a Britain of mixed memory. People spoke Christian language while practicing older rhythms. Saints replaced spirits, but the relationships remained. Sacred time was still felt, even when explained differently. Belief did not require clean boundaries to function. This lack of rupture unsettles later narratives that seek clarity. Conversion appears incomplete because it was never meant to be total. Christianity did not demand that Britain forget itself. It offered new stories that could hold existing meaning. Over generations, these blended practices became normal. Children learned Christian prayers alongside inherited customs. Nothing felt contradictory. Identity absorbed belief without breaking. What matters is not whether Christianity changed Britain. It did. What matters is how. Change came through accommodation rather than destruction. Meaning flowed forward rather than being forced into place. This process preserved continuity at a moment when writing returned. When chroniclers began recording events again, they captured a Britain already layered with belief. What they wrote reflected order, hierarchy, and doctrine. What they missed was how much had been carried forward quietly beneath those words. New faiths rarely erase old ones. They borrow. They adapt. They survive by listening. Britain's religious transformation followed this pattern, shaped by patience learned over centuries of adaptation. As monasteries grew and texts multiplied, history prepared to speak again with confidence. Writing would soon shape memory more sharply. What could be recorded would gain permanence. What remained unwritten would fade further into background. Yet beneath the coming chronicles, Britain still carried its older self. Belief remained grounded in land and season. Practice continued alongside prayer. Memory endured quietly. Now, history prepares to be written again. This time, the pen will choose more deliberately. Names will be fixed. Events will be ordered. What fits will survive on the page. What does not will remain in silence, waiting to be noticed by those willing to listen beyond written lines. The next chapter begins where words return and authority gathers, shaping how Britain will be remembered for centuries to come. Even as much of what endured quietly slips beyond record once more, preserved only in land, habit, and the deep rhythms that never needed writing to exist at all. Folklore did not emerge to entertain. It emerged to remember. Long after monuments weathered and records thinned, stories carried what mattered forward, wrapped in familiar shapes. A talking animal, a hidden path, a forbidden hill. These were not inventions for children, but containers for knowledge that needed to travel safely through time. In Britain, folklore became an archive that required no shelves, preserving memory in forms easy to repeat and hard to erase. These stories taught geography without maps. They warned where ground turned treacherous, where waters swallowed the unwary, where night travel invited loss. A tale about spirits at a river bend signaled danger. A legend of lights on the moor marked disorientation. What later sounded like fantasy once functioned as guidance, encoded so it could survive long after its original context faded. Folklore also carried ethics. Stories remembered consequences when law could not reach. Greed led to loss. Disrespect brought misfortune. Kindness returned unexpectedly. These lessons were not enforced by authority, but by narrative repetition. A story retold around fire taught behavior without instruction, shaping conduct gently across generations. Because folklore lived in speech, it adapted. Details shifted while purpose stayed intact. A warning moved locations. A moral adjusted to circumstance. This flexibility kept memory alive. Written rules fracture when conditions change. Stories bend. Britain relied on this bending to carry knowledge through invasion, conversion, and silence. Many tales preserved boundaries between safe and unsafe space. The forest edge, the crossroads, the ruined mound, these recurring settings mapped social awareness. Listeners learned where caution mattered. The story did the remembering, so people did not have to analyze each time. In this way, folklore stored experience efficiently. Folklore endured because it traveled lightly. Anyone could carry it. No permission was needed. When writing returned, stories slipped beneath notice, just as simple or childish. That dismissal protected them. What power overlooks often survives Conquest. Over centuries, these narratives layered. A medieval saint absorbed traits of an older spirit. A fairy road followed an ancient route. Meaning nested inside meaning. Even when belief systems changed, the stories still worked. They continued to guide behavior, mark danger, and explain loss without requiring agreement about origin. This is why folklore must be read carefully. It is not evidence of ignorance, but of precision, shaped for survival. Where chronicles list rulers, stories list risks. Where documents declare ownership, tales remember consequence. Together, they reveal a Britain that kept its past alive without writing it down. Fairy tales are older than kings because they served a different purpose. They kept memory mobile. They ensured that knowledge survived collapse, transition, and silence. They waited patiently for listeners willing to hear beyond surface meaning. Folklore did not compete with written history. It compensated for it. When records narrowed perspective, stories widened it. When authority fixed meaning, tales allowed it to breathe. Britain's unwritten archive remained accessible to anyone who listened, passed along in kitchens, fields, and night roads. Some memories hide in habit, others in story. Together they carried what could not be recorded, guiding life quietly until writing returned to claim the surface again. In this way, folklore bridges the gap between silence and text. It preserves continuity where documents fail. As the story moves forward, these hidden archives remain active, shaping behavior beneath written authority. Some memories hide in habit, preparing us to notice how everyday practice carries the past forward. These quiet carriers will matter deeply in what follows. When power writes history again, much will slip past the page. What survives will do so because it already knows how to endure without being named. This endurance keeps the older Britain present, even as new records speak loudly. The past remains active, waiting for listeners attentive enough to hear it. It has never left. It has simply learned how to whisper beneath history. That whisper carries us forward into the next layer of memory, together now. Some of Britain's oldest traditions survived not because they were protected, but because they were ordinary. They lived in habits repeated without ceremony, woven into the rhythm of work and season. By the time churches rose in stone, these customs were already ancient, practiced so naturally that they barely registered as belief at all. Seasonal festivals carried this continuity most clearly. The turning of the year was marked long before calendars fixed dates to parchment. Fires signaled transition. Feasts followed harvest. Quiet observances accompanied winter's depth and spring's return. When Christianity arrived, it did not erase these moments. It settled into them. The timing remained. The meaning adjusted. Rural practices proved especially resilient. In fields and villages far from centers of learning, people continued to follow patterns that worked. Livestock were moved when they always had been. Crops were planted by signs learned through experience. Certain days carried weight without explanation. These habits did not challenge new belief. They existed alongside it. Church festivals often aligned closely with older observances. This was not coincidence. Adaptation made adoption easier. Familiar rhythms anchored unfamiliar stories. What mattered was not origin, but continuity. The year still turned. Life still required markers. Christianity learned the land rather than forcing it to forget. This process did not feel like loss to those living through it. Nothing important vanished. Old practices gained new language, but their function remained. A blessing replaced an offering. A saint stood where a spirit once had. The relationship persisted. Because these customs were practical, they avoided scrutiny. No authority questioned why people gathered when they always had. No record noted the persistence of older meaning. What is unnoticed often survives longest. These traditions carried ethical memory as well. Cooperation at harvest, hospitality during scarcity, restraint in winter. Such values were reinforced through custom rather than command. They did not require doctrine. They required participation. Christianity absorbed these ethics easily because they aligned with its teachings, though they predated them by centuries. Over time, the origin of these practices faded from awareness. They became simply the way things were done. Children learned them without questioning source. This forgetting was not erasure. It was protection. What cannot be traced cannot be targeted. Even as writing returned and authority strengthened, these customs persisted quietly. They appeared harmless, even quaint. Yet beneath their simplicity lay deep continuity. They carried forward ways of relating to land, time, and community that had survived conquest, migration, and conversion. This endurance reframes how change is understood. Britain did not leap from pagan to Christian, from ancient to medieval. It layered. The surface shifted. The foundation remained. Continuity flowed through practice rather than proclamation. Some traditions survived because no one noticed them. They asked for no attention. They demanded no defense. They lived where power rarely looked. As monasteries recorded saints and kings, the countryside recorded seasons. While chronicles fixed events, fields repeated cycles. Writing captured moments. Custom carried time. This distinction matters. It shows how memory persists beneath record. It explains why Britain's past feels present in ways that cannot be fully explained by text alone. Still, the land remembers through use. People remember through habit. Soon, writing returns with confidence. History will speak again in names and dates. What fits will be preserved. What does not will recede further into background. Yet these older customs will continue, unnoticed but active, shaping life beneath the page. They prepare us to see the return of writing not as recovery, but as selection. The next section steps into that moment, when history begins to speak loudly again, unaware of how much it has already missed. The past does not end when writing resumes. It simply moves deeper, carried by hands that continue to do what they have always done. Quietly, enduring, unrecorded. There was a moment in Britain's past when life was fully lived but barely recorded. A narrow stretch of time where memory still guided meaning. Yet writing hovered just beyond reach. It was a Britain between worlds, shaped by habit and story, but not yet fixed by ink. This was the last unwritten Britain, complete in itself, unaware that it was about to be translated. Daily life moved with confidence. Fields were worked according to knowledge refined across generations. Paths were followed because they were known, not because they were mapped. People understood where they belonged without needing it named. Authority rested in familiarity. Memory was trusted because it had not yet failed. Nothing about this Britain felt unfinished. It did not experience itself as temporary or incomplete. It had no sense of waiting for history to arrive. The idea that life needed recording to matter had not yet taken hold. Meaning lived in practice, not preservation. Stories continued to circulate without concern for accuracy, as later ages would define it. What mattered was usefulness. A story that guided behavior survived. One that no longer served quietly disappeared. Memory adjusted naturally, like land responding to weather. No effort was made to fix it in place. Belief remained embedded in landscape and season. Sacredness did not require buildings or doctrine. It lived in repetition. A hill remembered. A well-received attention. A gathering returned year after year. Meaning persisted because it was enacted, not declared. Identity also remained flexible. People belonged to families, places, and practices rather than abstract groups. Names mattered locally. Allegiance shifted with circumstance. Nothing demanded permanent definition. This looseness allowed continuity without rigidity. This Britain would later appear elusive because it left so little behind. There were no chronicles eager to explain it. No lists of rulers to anchor it. What remains are traces in soil, language, and habit. Enough to suggest fullness, but not enough to narrate itself. Archaeology offers glimpses, repaired tools, reused spaces, patterns of living that continue without interruption. These signs point to stability rather than decline. Life did not wait for writing to resume. It went on without concern for record. This final unwritten moment is difficult to imagine because it lacks voice. It does not announce itself. It does not argue its importance. It simply exists, confident in its own continuity. Later centuries would overlook it, not because it failed, but because it did not explain itself. There is a quiet privilege in noticing this Britain. It reminds us that most human life passes without record. That absence does not diminish its meaning. It only changes how we must listen. Soon, this world would begin to change. Writing would return, carried by institutions that valued permanence. Memory would shift outward, from people to pages. Authority would begin to favor what could be recorded. When that happened, the unwritten Britain did not vanish overnight. It receded. It became background. Its rhythms continued beneath new structures. But its voice grew quieter as attention turned toward text. This is the Britain history never met, not because it was hidden, but because history arrived late. When the scribes finally looked outward, they saw a land already shaped by centuries of lived experience. They captured fragments and called them beginnings. What they missed was the depth beneath, the accumulation of practice, the quiet confidence of a society that did not need to be explained to exist. Standing at this threshold, Britain carries both worlds. Memory still breathes through habit. Writing prepares to claim authority. The balance is about to shift. Now, the scribes arrive. They will bring order, dates, and names. They will decide what counts. What survives on the page will feel permanent. What remains unwritten will fade further from view. Yet beneath their words, the older Britain will continue, patient and unrecorded, waiting for those who listen beyond text. This moment marks not an ending, but a narrowing. History prepares to speak loudly again. What it says will shape centuries. What it does not say will still matter. The next chapter begins with ink touching parchment, fixing memory into lines that endure, even as the deeper past slips quietly beneath them, unchanged, unseen, and still alive. When writing returned to Britain, it did not arrive as a neutral witness. It arrived with authority. Ink touched parchment carrying more than memory. It carried choice. From this moment forward, what could be written would endure, and what could not would begin to slip away. Not suddenly, but steadily. Writing brought clarity, but it also brought boundaries. Stories that fit into lines, dates, and hierarchies found a home on the page. Lives that unfolded through habit, movement, and shared knowing proved harder to contain. The page preferred names over patterns, events over processes, rulers over relationships. What aligned with this preference survived. What did not grew faint. This was not deliberate erasure. It was selection shaped by structure. Writing demands sequence. It requires beginnings, middles, and ends. Cycles confuse it. Overlap resists it. The Live Britain that had thrived in repetition and flexibility now faced a tool that favored fixity. Monasteries became centers of this new authority. Within their walls, memory was transferred from people to pages. Knowledge gained permanence but also rigidity. Once written, it resisted change. What had once adapted easily now froze into form. This gave writing power unmatched by memory alone. Authority followed the written word. Laws recorded held more weight than customs remembered. Genealogies written down established legitimacy. Ownership became clearer when it could be documented. Writing did not invent power, but it amplified it, concentrating influence among those who controlled the page. History, from this point, began to narrow. It focused on what could be preserved rather than what had been lived. Events were elevated above continuity. The dramatic overshadowed the habitual. Silence filled the spaces where writing could not reach. This shift reshaped how the past was understood. What appeared on the page felt complete, authoritative, final. What remained unwritten felt uncertain, even suspect. Over time, this imbalance hardened. Written history came to define reality itself. Yet writing also obscured. By fixing one version, it excluded others. Multiple perspectives collapsed into singular narratives. Local variation flattened. Memory that once lived in many voices now spoke through few. This is where power truly settled, not only in rulers or institutions, but in the act of recording. To decide what was worth writing was to decide what mattered. Writing did not begin history. It selected it. The unwritten Britain did not vanish when this happened. It receded further from view. Its practices continued, but their origins blurred. Without record, they lost visibility. Over generations, they became custom without context, habit without explanation. What survived writing did so by fitting its frame. What did not fit faded into background. This fading was gradual, almost gentle, but its effect was lasting. Once forgotten, certain ways of seeing could not be fully recovered. This is why some losses feel permanent, not because they were destroyed, but because they were never recorded in forms that writing could preserve. Memory carried them for a time, but memory changes. Without reinforcement, detail dissolves. Writing reshaped time itself. The past became something behind rather than beneath. Progress replaced continuity. Origins gained importance. Everything before felt preparatory rather than complete. This reframing still shapes how history is told. We search for beginnings because writing requires them. We accept silence as absence because the page is blank. Yet life continued regardless of record. Understanding writing as power changes how we read history. It invites us to notice what is missing, not as failure, but as evidence of another way of living. It reminds us that history is not the total of what happened, but what was chosen to remain. As writing tightened its hold, some things slipped beyond recovery. Entire worldviews, languages, and systems of meaning thinned beyond recognition. What could not be adapted to ink was lost not through violence, but through neglect. Some things are permanently lost. The next section steps into that quiet loss, examining what cannot be reclaimed and why its absence still shapes how we understand Britain's deepest past today. Some losses leave no scars on the land, no broken walls, no collapsed roofs. They vanish without sound, slipping away between generations, unnoticed until the silence becomes permanent. These are the losses that shape Britain's past most deeply, not because they were dramatic, but because they were complete. Languages disappeared without record. Entire ways of shaping thought dissolved when the last speakers stopped speaking. Words that carried meanings no other language could hold faded quietly. Concepts tied to land, season, and relationship vanished with them. Once gone, they left no trace strong enough to reconstruct. Translation cannot recover what was never written. Rituals followed the same path. Actions repeated for centuries ended when repetition broke. Not through prohibition, but through forgetting. A gesture omitted once became optional. Omitted again, it disappeared. Without instruction or record, the sequence unraveled. What remained was absence without memory of loss. Worldviews dissolved even more completely. Ways of understanding time, self, and belonging that had guided life for generations slipped beyond reach. These were not beliefs that could be summarized. They were frameworks lived daily. When daily life changed, the framework loosened, then vanished. Nothing replaced it directly. Archaeology cannot recover these losses. Objects tell only part of the story. A tool reveals use, not meaning. A burial reveals care, not belief. Without language and memory, interpretation remains tentative. We infer, but never fully know. This is why the greatest losses leave no ruins. They leave gaps that feel natural because nothing marks where something once stood. Silence blends into background. Absence feels normal. The narration of history often favors what can be rebuilt. What cannot be reconstructed is rarely mourned. Yet these unseen losses shaped how Britain would think, speak, and remember itself. They narrowed possibility quietly. Respecting this loss means accepting uncertainty without forcing answers. It means allowing silence to remain silence. Some knowledge was not meant to survive outside the lives that carried it. Its disappearance does not diminish its value. It confirms its intimacy. There is no tragedy in this understanding. Loss is not failure. It is part of continuity. Human societies change by letting go as much as by preserving. What remains does so because it adapts. What does not was complete in its time. This perspective softens the desire to recover everything. Not all pasts are recoverable. Not all meanings survive translation across centuries. Accepting this allows history to breathe without becoming conquest of memory. Sleep comes easier when not every question demands resolution. The unwritten Britain does not need to be fully known to be honored. Its absence carries weight precisely because it resists capture. What remains is fragmentary, but not empty. Traces persist in rhythm, habit, and land. The loss sharpens attention to what survived. Some languages vanished, but others adapted. Some rituals ended, but patterns continued. Some worldviews dissolved, but their influence lingers subtly in how people relate to place and season. The unknowable does not erase the known. It frames it. It reminds us that history is partial by nature. What we inherit is not totality, but selection shaped by chance, power, and survival. These losses teach humility. They remind us that future generations will inherit only fragments of the present. Much will fade without record. That does not make it meaningless now. What we will never recover still matters. It shaped the ground from which later Britain emerged. It influenced what survived, even as it disappeared. The silence left behind is not empty. It holds the outline of what once was, felt rather than seen. Respecting that silence allows the past to remain human rather than solved. Yet something remains. Not in words, but in continuity. Not in record, but in presence. The final section turns toward what endured despite loss, tracing the quiet persistence that still shapes Britain beneath history's surface today. Britain did not disappear beneath history. It layered. What came later did not erase what came before. It settled on top of it, like soil gathering over long-used paths, softening their edges without removing their direction. The oldest, Britain, never left. It learned how to remain unnoticed. Walk the land today, and the past still answers quietly. Paths curve where they always have, following ground that feels right underfoot. Fields hold shapes older than fences, responding to slope, water, and wind rather than design. Seasons arrive with a familiarity that predates calendars. The land remembers what writing forgot. These rhythms were never stored in books. They lived in movement, in when people rise, when they gather, when they rest. Even now, daily life bends subtly around patterns formed long before wombs were fixed to places. The past persists not as memory recalled, but as behavior repeated. Britain's history often feels like a series of arrivals. Romans, Saxons, kings, faiths. Yet beneath these layers, the land remains the constant. It absorbs change without surrendering form. Each new system adjusts to what already works. Roads follow older routes. Towns grow where people once gathered. Continuity hides beneath innovation. This is why the deepest Britain feels difficult to describe. It does not announce itself. It does not require recognition. It exists as background, shaping choices without explanation. When something feels traditional, familiar, or natural, it often carries more history than we can name. The land still teaches quietly. Where not to build, where to pause, where water gathers, where sound travels. These lessons do not belong to any one era. They are cumulative, learned and relearned through experience. Modern life overlays them, but does not replace them. What survives longest is what adapts without demanding attention. Britain's oldest knowledge did not insist on preservation. It embedded itself in habit. That is why it endured conquest, conversion, and record. It was never something to be taken. It had already become part of living. This understanding reframes history itself. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us, supporting what came later. Each era rests on foundations it did not build and rarely notices. Writing captures only the uppermost layer. The deeper ones remain active, shaping behavior silently. Standing in a field, on a road, or beside a river, it is possible to feel this depth without naming it. The sense of rightness, of continuity, does not require explanation. It is inherited through place. The land holds memory more patiently than people do. This is why Britain never truly resets. It accumulates. New systems come and go, but the underlying patterns persist. Even forgetting becomes part of continuity. What is forgotten leaves space. What remains fills it. The story does not end with medieval chronicles, nor with modern boundaries. It settles into landscape, waiting to be noticed again. History may narrow its focus, but the land keeps the whole. To recognize the Britain beneath Britain is not to reject what followed. It is to see it more clearly. Every castle sits on older ground. Every village overlays earlier movement. Every tradition echoes something deeper than its recorded origin. The oldest Britain never left because it did not need to. It was never threatened by change. It learned how to pass through it, reshaping itself just enough to endure. As this story comes to rest, it does not close. It slows. It invites attention rather than conclusion. The past remains present, not as mystery to solve, but as presence to feel. Paths still lead where they always have. Seasons still return. The land still listens. Britain continues, layered and patient, carrying every version of itself at once. The story does not end. It settles. And in that settling, it waits, quietly, for the next listener willing to notice what has always been there.